just introduce myself. I serve as a special advisor to the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs at the State Department, Don Liu. And I think in many ways, Dr. Debroy articulated pretty clearly the 7 pillars of transformation for India's economy. So I kind of feel like our panel may be redundant to some extent, but this discussion of the factor markets underwriting India's economic expansion, albeit in the context of agriculture, the change in labor and technology specifically, I think are worth diving into. And that's what we'll endeavor to do today. On the labor side of the house, looking at the emergence of women and youth in India's economy and driving the potential to drive economic expansion, and on productivity, the role that technology is playing today. I want to just thank Dr. Dasher for having us here today, as well as Amit. I think this broad transformation is worth noting in and of itself, but the potential for the US-India relationship to really maximize these opportunities is what we're really here to discuss. And I would be remiss to not thank our hosts for really bringing out this opportunity and creating a platform for us to collaborate between the 2 countries. And my colleagues here joining us from USAID, Karen Klimowski, who is a huge partner in the work that I do as Executive Director for the US-India Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment, the Government of India. And many of you who are in this room are actually huge partners for the State Department, for which we're very grateful. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my fellow panelists to just introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive into conversation.
I'm Rohini Somanathan. I'm a professor at the Delhi School of Economics and visiting Stanford this year at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences up on the Hill.
I'm Vinod. I'm with a startup called Unifo, which is one of the fastest growing AI startups in Silicon Valley. But I think I'm here because I'm the co-chair for the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum's Startup Connect program. And I'm part of the founding team at a founder nonprofit called SAS Bhumi, which is essentially a founder paid forward collective to build $1 trillion of market cap from India SAS.
Hi, I'm Harshul Asnani from Tech Mahindra. For those of you who don't know Tech Mahindra, we are one of the largest technology consulting and services companies from India, about 160,000 people. A very large majority of them are in India. I run the technology sector for the company. The business unit that I oversee has about 20,000 plus people. I've been in the Bay Area for 20 plus years.
Thanks so much. Dr. Somanathan, I wondered if we could start with you. You're doing quite innovative work on the role that social development plays in shaping public policy. And I wondered if you could just set the stage. We've heard a lot about gender, and John Chambers highlighted the transformation for women in the workforce last night. Several of the panels today have discussed this topic. What are the shifts that you're seeing in women entering the workforce, and how did the pandemic really impact women in India?
So maybe I could show you some numbers that I've been putting together. Do we have those together?
Right
and,
yeah.
And do we have a remote of some kind?
There's a remote.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I just put a few numbers together because often when we're talking about India, each of us has a different sector in mind, a different region in mind, and it might just be useful to see what the bigger picture looks like. So if you look at female labor force participation, yesterday John Chambers was talking about women in engineering institutions and how high this number is. But actually, if you look at the workforce overall, labor force participation rates in India are among the lowest in the world. So if you look, it's South Asia, Northern Africa, these rates are much lower than anywhere else in the world. And it's hard to say, when you're looking at a snapshot, it's hard to say, look, how much of this is temporary, how much of this is being part of some trajectory that then moves around. And if you look at, so the question is this just a matter of where we are in the process of development? And this is a very well-known hypothesis, the U-shaped hypothesis of labor force participation. And the idea is just when you start off, you have a lot of farm work. It's easier for women to contribute to farm work and do other things. as you grow, men go into the cities, and so there's going to be some shift, and eventually women will catch up. So that's broadly the U-shaped hypothesis. And if you look at lots of countries across the world, then there is this broad pattern there. However, you'll see that even here, and this is data from the 1980s, it's a famous paper by Claudia Golden, an economic historian, you'll find that India is off the curve and below it, right? But the thing is it moving along it as it's got richer since 1991, especially? And the answer is really no. So if you look at historical trajectories of the OECD countries, you do find that in the post-war period, female labor force participation went up dramatically. Okay? It was a little bit different across different countries, and it's notable. So if you see Germany lower there, just keep that in your minds, and we might be able to get to talk about why that's the case. But broadly speaking, everything was moving in the same direction. And there were two components of this. One is that the economy was expanding, but also social spending was expanding. So you went from the state being about 10% of national income at the turn of the century, almost across the board, to somewhere between 40 and 60%, depending on where in Europe you were. So both of those things were happening side by side. Okay, let's see what was happening in India. And here you see that there's something a bit puzzling. For the last 15 years or so, labor force participation in India has been declining for women. And we've been wondering why, what's going on. And I don't have any answers for you, but I have some patterns that you can use to actually think about what you believe. So India is going down, and it's not that all of South Asia is going down. India is going down. Is it fertility? So is it that we're having more children than other countries, and so women are involved with looking after them? India is not really an outlier on the fertility dimension. Fertility in India has been going down pretty rapidly. All right. What about education? So here you find stagnancy in secondary education. So, you know, if you look at, again, the recent years, you find that secondary school enrollment has flattened out. Okay, so maybe that's part of the story. All right. If you look at occupational patterns, well, if you look at low education, so less than primary education, it's mainly agriculture and construction, both for men and women. When you start looking beyond that, for women, you have personal services. For men, you have transport, driving cars, trucks, that kind of thing. For women, working in households. Okay. If you look at higher education, then for women, it's largely education and medical. And for men, it's various things. And I haven't broken. This is data from the Indian Human Development Survey. It's not huge, so I haven't broken it down by industry. You'd need something else to look at that. Now, here's what I find interesting. If you look at participation by gender, then you find that urban participation is lower for women, not for men. Okay? And if you look at education, there's a U shape there. So just like you found this U shape with the level of income when you're looking at a cross-section of countries, at a particular point in time, you find that as women get a little more educated, participation actually goes down. And then when you start looking at graduate or more, then it seems to go up again. So this is a bit of a puzzle. Why are you finding this? All right? And this is a nice forum to ask these questions because we have people on many sides of this. Usually academics are talking to academics and development economists are talking to development economists. And now you can actually look at it both from the point of view of hiring people, looking for skills, and from the state in terms of what it's doing for women. So you see this U shape with education, and there's something about women here, not about both men and women. And then the other thing is, if you look at having a child in the household, so this is, do you have a child less than 6 years in the household? And you see again that there's no pattern for men. You do have a pattern for women. So you see the same U shape with education. And you see it especially in the secondary and senior secondary. So if you've gone to secondary school, then you participate at lower rates than the rest of the labor force. If you have a child, then for all levels of education, you participate at lower rates. Okay? So these are just some numbers, and I look forward to hearing what my panelists have to say. But I think the final thoughts, as a development economist who's worked on credit, on various gender issues, on the environment, and has spent a fair amount of time in the field, I think there's the demand side, and I think a lot of the venture capitalists, a lot of the corporate leaders will have things to say in terms of what role can we play in recruitment and training? Okay? The only thing I'd emphasize is we need resources on the supply side. So we need childcare and we need basic education, because otherwise on the demand side, you don't have enough to play with. So I think that both of these things are really complementary. I think this is a nice place to think about them, because you're really thinking about partnerships between the state, both states, and the private sector. And so I think you need to think about what gaps each of these sides can bring to the table. So stop there, maybe just come back if
No, this is, it aligns the emphasis that you placed on breaking silos and talking amidst sectors is something that we are really invested in, at least at the State Department. Through the US-India Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment, we're looking at, and we are pulling in government, civil society, the private sector, and philanthropy to tackle both demand and supply side questions. So I'm looking forward to diving into that a little bit more. Perhaps over to Harshal and Vinod. We talked a little bit, and John Chambers also referenced this yesterday, this demographic dividend that we have in the burgeoning number of youth entering India's economy today. I wondered if you could talk about the war on talent and what it really takes today to help prepare, retain, and really help young people thrive in India's economy, and perhaps starting with you, Harshal.
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Radhika. See, I'll talk about this subject from a technology perspective, okay? And at the outset, I would like to lay out some data points to frame the discussion and contextualize it from where I'm coming from a Tech Mahindra standpoint. We today hire about, give or take, 500 people per week. It's quite a size and scale. Today, almost 90% of our associates are either millennials, Generation X, or Gen Z. Out of the 160,000 people that we have as a company, more than 110,000 people are based out of India. We also have an increasing presence in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities in India. Now, if you consider Pune as a Tier 2 city, we have almost 25% of our labor force sitting in Tier 2, Tier 3. If I remove Pune, it's about 10,000 people, so I would say roughly 10% of our workforce sits in Tier 2 cities today. With that as a backdrop, if we are to look at some high-level numbers, I think the median age of the Indian population today is 29 years old. 2/3 of that population is in the age group of roughly between 18 to 64, so which is the workforce of India. It's almost 2/3 of it. And this so-called golden period of demographic dividend is likely to continue for another 20 years, right? It's only going to bulge more and more. The country is getting, if not younger, it's likely to stay at the same median age for the next foreseeable future. So with that as a background, I see this as an opportunity and also see that as a challenge. Opportunities are in some sense pretty obvious, that for the foreseeable future, we'll have an ample number of young workforce available to cater to the growth of India. And also there is a surety that the current population that we have will still be at an employment age for the next 2 decades. And also, one of the McKinsey reports said that in the next 5 to 6 years, there will be 60 million new people which will enter the workforce. And there will be another 30 million new people which will exit the farming and come into non-farming businesses. So there is a 90 million of new workforce which is going to come into the market. On top of that, if you see the whole untapped potential in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities that is emerging today. Yeah? Just on one end, you look at the age. On the other end, you look at the new workforce that is coming in. And if you look at the untapped potential that we have in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, which are just about starting to emerge. And the tier 2, tier 3 definition of cities in India is almost like a tier 1 city in the Western world, right? A tier 2 city like, say, an Ahmedabad, if you call it a tier 2, is almost 88 million people. So those cities, that are 10 or 12 of those tier 2 cities are now getting started to emerge. With that said, I think paradoxically, India has a massive deficit in employment. As per, I think, a report by the India Skill Report of 2022, it says that over 50% of Indian population is today unemployable. Yeah? So there is a massive gap between the number of people available to work and the skill sets required to work. So unless the skilling in India and the reskilling in India and the academics and the curriculum in India steps up to meet the demands of what the workforce, the companies really need, I think India is going to continue to face challenge. Other challenges, while we are bullish about tier 2, the more we go deeper and higher in tier 2 cities, we are realizing that many of the tier 2 city aspirants have an aspiration to move to tier 1 cities and move from small towns to big towns in search of better job opportunities, etc. So it's very paradoxical. On one end, we are seeing more growth happening in tier 2. On the other end, we are seeing more and more of those people want to move into the tier 1 cities. We are still very untapped, as Rohini just mentioned, in terms of the women workforce participation. As an organization, we have, I think, about 1/3, about 35% of our workforce is women. We are working very hard to increase that number. In fact, we have gone up 1 or 2% year on year. We are increasing the women participation in our workforce, but it's just getting a little harder and harder, and we'll talk about it as we go along. But bringing more and more workforce into the female workforce into the workforce, there are more than 55 million women kind of getting ready to come into the workforce. So that's going to be a force multiplier in more ways than one. Yeah. So on one end, I see opportunities, but on the other end, if the economy doesn't grow, for the country to be able to absorb this kind of workforce coming in, if it's not able to absorb, there could be massive socioeconomic issues in the country. But if it is able to absorb it, it has to grow at least at the rate of 8 to 8.5% for the next decade, right? For it to create ample number of jobs. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I don't have the big numbers Harshul has, but yeah, a startup in its life, if it hires 500 people, unless it goes public, insanely fortunate. So the number is small, but the difference is there's tens of thousands of startups. There's at least 10 of my friends who've started a startup anywhere in the last 12 to 24 months, and they all employ today a couple hundred people, right? So the smaller scale of startups is compensated for by just the extreme velocity with which new startups are coming up. So the POV I want to present essentially is what comes in the way of India becoming the product and knowledge center of the world, which is the goal that we committed to. And the two things that come to mind, I don't want to belabor the things you've said, you've made great points. I really want to double down on the knowledge to the skill gap, essentially. So a lot of education doesn't automatically translate to employable skills. And that's why you have startups like Zoho, for example, completely for-profit, completely privately held, but they've done two things which I think are incredible and need to be repeated. The first thing they've done is they've started the Zoho Academy, which is, if you're, literally, they don't even need for you to be a graduate. They say, do you have these basic PCM, physics, chemistry, math skills? Awesome. Come in and I will train you in technologies that will make you relevant for the next 20 years in tech. And out of that Zoho University, they obviously absorb a lot of people, but they also create talent for the rest of the industry. Unfortunately, not every startup has the ability to invest in that kind of skill creation, right? That's something that should be done with a public-private kind of partnership, and we should create more skills. The second thing they've done, which I think is even more spectacular, is they have a huge center in Chennai, but they've gone to, I think, Tenkasi, which is a tier 3 town in India. And to his point, the tier 3 town probably has a few 100,000 people. So it's larger than Palo Alto in terms of number of people. But it is a tier 3 town. And they've gone there, they've set up the academy there, moved the HQ there, and said, this, talent is ubiquitous, opportunity is not. So let's take opportunity to talent. So that to me is the real gap for me. One is skills, next is the access to opportunity. If opportunity gets centralized in Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore and these big cities, it is highly problematic. But the good news I have for you is that, again, of the friends I mentioned who started startups, they're in Calcutta, not to say it's a tier 2 city, but it's not known to be a tech capital, right? But now you have great startups coming from there. And when they look at centers outside of Calcutta to hire people, they go to the Northeast. And suddenly you're including more people in, right? So that's really, for me, the opportunity and the challenge. The two come beautifully intertwined, and we can solve for both of them, I believe, as we go along in the conversation. We can talk about it a bit.
Well, it's interesting because so much of what you're calling for is sort of a focus and a spotlight on innovation, the innovation economy, and how policy and government and academia can come together. And I see in India's national education policy and the science and technology policy, a lot of the thematic areas that we're talking about are actually integrated into this policy. And now it seems as if you're all alluding to the importance of implementation and execution. And I wondered, maybe Harshal, if you could talk about how does Tech Mahindra see the future of the innovation economy in India and concrete steps that need to be taken to take some of these high-level policies and put them into action to accrue not just to one segment, but all Indians?
So the way I see it, India has a unique opportunity to move from being called as a nation for outsourcing to a nation for innovation. If you really see what is the secret sauce of Silicon Valley, had it not been for Stanford, I'm not sure how far Silicon Valley would have gone, right? So it's the university network on one end, the education and the university network that this place has. It is the flow of venture money that this place has. And while culture is definitely there, the fail fast, fail forward culture of the Silicon Valley, which is so unique, but the network of people, so one company begets another company. People coming out of Oracle start a startup, moving out of the startup, move into something else. So this whole network which has been built here, which is so unique, one company begetting another and then creating something much bigger, I think are broadly the three legs of the stool, if you will, which in my view has made Silicon Valley what it is. And it has not been replicable for many years anywhere around the world, but I believe the time may have come for India to replicate something similar. The venture flow has really started flowing into India in a big way. The culture of people not being afraid of working in startups and failing, I think that has been a sea change in the last 5 to 7 years that we have seen, and the results are there for everybody to see, the number of startups that have come out of the country. But while I would call this is a unique opportunity for India to grow, but for innovation to really thrive in India, in my view, a few things have to happen. Obviously the government's framework has to be a catalyst to promote startups the way they need to go. But I think on the global innovation index, if you see, today I think India has come up several notches. I think from number 80 to probably we are in the top 40. But even if you look at if you break down that global innovation rankings, there are high-income countries, there are upper middle-class countries, there are lower middle-class countries, and the lower middle-class countries where India features, India is number one, right, in terms of global innovation index. It has come up significantly. And as the economy grows, there's a likelihood that India will move its category from lower income to an upper income category. And for it to be a serious player, I think, as I was saying earlier, I think the whole education system has to come together, right? The curriculum versus the skill gap that we have today is massive, right? For example, we have set up Mahindra University in India. The underlying philosophy behind setting up the Mahindra University is that we are realizing that today in India, the education is focused more on knowledge and less on skills. And by the way, this is a completely a philanthropic initiative by the Mahindra Group. All the Mahindra Group companies, in some sense, are using their own CSR funds to promote this university. And the students who are graduating from Mahindra University are not likely only to be absorbed in the Mahindra Group. Many large corporates in India are today tapping into Mahindra University, and it's becoming one of the most prominent universities. Though it's a very young university, it's becoming very prominent in the state of Telangana. It's in Hyderabad. The whole purpose behind this is the pedagogy of that university is based on skill building, yeah, and not necessarily on knowledge. What does the industry really need? I think that is the gap that India as a whole has to fix before we can say that the global innovation can go to the masses.
I wonder, Vinod, do you have anything to add to that, given your work with SAS Boomi and Startup Connector?
Yeah, I think, for the longest time, I used to be a believer that, the statistically proven fact is diverse workplaces are more productive, more profitable. And the other notion I had, let me state it so I can tell you how wrong I was that if you just create an open door policy purely merit-based, you'll just end up with the right kind of workplace, right? And that showed out in my startup. When I built my startup, we had 40% women in the workforce in a hardcore tech company. 2 out of our 5 board members were women. Those were the only 2 optional board members. The other 3 of us were there because there was no choice. And so I looked at it and I said, this is how the world should function. But that's incredibly wrong. The reason that's incredibly wrong is because when you look at a job in tech, it's like the 4th leg of a 4 into 100 meter sort of a relay race, right? So I can stand at the 300-meter mark and say, hey, the door's open, it's purely merit-based, so everyone should get equal opportunity. But I think there are 3 other legs where certain segments of society are just very, very disadvantaged. The first really is access to education. We saw some incredible statistics here, right? It almost seems, is either don't study or go do your graduation, right? Don't get stuck in high school, right? And it's funny because labor force participation for women without education was like 50%, and then you come to high school and it goes down. So the point is, access to education already removes such a significant number of people from even getting the chance to come to that 4th leg. So we need to work on that, right? Unfortunately, that is a public sector job, right? It's just the governments just have to do it. The second thing is access to opportunity. Opportunity meaning, so you got education, now did that translate to jobs, right? And the amount of, we had a long discussion, if you remember last year, on subconscious bias, right? Women, others, sections of society just face a lot of subconscious bias, which just shows up in non-official ways, and suddenly when the result turns out, you're like, geez, there's not enough women in the room. So that's the other thing. And the third is, once you've gotten the opportunity, a majority of my friends who founded startups worked in these tech companies in roles wherein they truly understood the gravy making. They understood how these businesses are built, how these markets are built, what's missing in a certain economy, and then said, geez, I can go out and start a company to solve that problem. You can't hypothesize that by reading The Economist, right? You got to be in there. So once you're in these organizations, are you getting the career growth? Are you getting the opportunity? Are you getting the ability to participate in these really core activities? Now this person is ready to be a job creator, right? So those 3 legs, differing levels, public, private, we need to really work on. And that's why I moved away from merit only, saying we need to create some goals and some imperatives to make sure that we give everyone an equal chance to come to the 4th leg of that 400-meter relay. Now you have a point where it's merit only, and let everyone compete on their own skills. So that's really my big thought process around driving innovation in India. And the good news for me, to be honest, is as I look around in my peer group, I see the green sprouts of change actually happen. But do we have a long way to go? I saw the previous session, so we have some ways to go, but I'm very, very optimistic on where we're generally headed.
I think I generally share that assessment. Oh, sorry, Harshal, over
So
to you.
Radhika, no, if I just have to build on what Vinod just said, and this is a question more for you, Vinod. We are a 40-year-old services company with our own legacy. You guys are a young startup. Typically when customers outsource to us, Indian IT services industry has typically been known to be order takers. And the startups that have been built in the 5 to 7 years are an exact opposite of that. And they're saying that the valuation that the startups are likely to create in the next 10 years is going to be more than the valuation created by the IT services sector in the last 40 years. What has really changed is the mindset. It's the culture. Because when customers typically come and tell services companies like us that if we ask an Indian IT services company to build say hypothetically speaking, a table with 3 legs, they'll build a beautiful table with 3 legs. But nobody will go and tell the customer that your table will be stable if it has a 4th leg. We don't go and think beyond just taking an order.
Yeah.
That's what Indian services companies were known for. But what the startup growth in India has shown, right, is something very, very different. And we are also seeing that massive change happening in how customers are perceiving us today. They are looking at us as a solution-centric company. They're looking at us as a 5G-centric company. They're no longer looking at companies like Tech Mahindra to be glorified body shops sitting in India. We, in fact, have a state-of-the-art 5G lab right now. It's considered to be an essential service, which operates right out of Fremont here in California, which drives so much of innovation around 5G that we have 75% of cell phones that operate in the United States are tested in that lab before they go out into the field. And not many people know that Indian services companies have taken a plunge and gotten to that point. So from your viewpoint, see, Unifor started in India, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 10, 15 years ago.
Far too long ago, but 14 years.
And then you moved to the US.
Yeah.
In your view, from how startups are looked at in India, what has changed?
So I have a homegrown theory. There's too many academics here, so I'll try to keep my theories concise, lest you get after me. But my theory is that after post-independence, India essentially exported intellect, right? The smartest Indians just went wherever in the world where there was opportunity for education and this and that. Then when the tech booms happened, the intellect belonged to somebody else and the property was generated in India. That's services, right? Somebody said, I've got the ideas, make the 3-legged table and we'd make it whatever. Now you've got this beautiful mix where the intellect is Indian and the property is Indian. So the IP actually belongs to India. Instead of generating services and being paid time and material, which is still a very large business, make no mistake. Now when you talk about the 3-legged table, we're saying, hey, there is a way to make a 3-legged table that balances beautifully, So that's a product, right? That's a product. You don't need 4 legs. I'll save you some wood, 3 legs, and I'll make you a perfectly stable table. And that really is, for me, incredible because so many people have worked in large companies such as yourself, worked with uber large enterprises all across the world, seen what mission-critical applications look like, seen what hyperscale looks like, seen why this takes 12 months when this could be done in 2, and then come back and say, I can actually create a product around this. And that is the real transformation. So without the intellect first being exported, without the property first being exported, we could not have reached where we are today. So full respect to all the layers that preceded. But the new gen has access to a few things that I think are very incredible. First of all, I think the new generation is incredibly confident. The risk appetite is very high. There was a time when you only had to finish college and join big companies. Now startups are attractive enough. And a lot of people have come back to the workforce having worked at these uber large companies like yourself or American companies or whatever. And they actually have a very, very in-depth understanding of what challenges technology can solve. And that's why I mentioned that when I came to women in the workforce, if you don't have access to the inner circle, so to speak, you may have worked at a JP Morgan, but you have no idea what that company does for a living, because you do your little bit. So that's coming together. And I think the hallmark of the startups essentially is audacity. And I genuinely think our goal, and we'll talk about it later, is $1 trillion of market cap from India SaaS. But I know we're going to talk about that next, so I'm going to hold my thoughts on that.
It's a very interesting thing you said, Vinod, because what we have seen in the last few years is a mindset change in our employees, right? Earlier, people used to join us for the safety net. Today, the whole great resignation era that we talk about, when we look at our attrition and where people are leaving us and going, earlier they used to go to a TCS and an Infosys or any other large corporate. Today, we are losing people to Unifor.
I'm happy to hear that. That's all I can say.
There's a bunch of startups who are just taking up people at salaries which are in a different orbit. One of my young engineers, we used to love him. He left us and joined a startup. And he said, these guys are not only paying me 40% more salary, they're giving me a BMW.
Not us. I'm just watching. I didn't get one either.
He's a 27-year-old engineer with about 3-4 years of experience. Okay, so the BMW belongs to that startup. The car is leased to him for 3 years, and if he works well and does well, whatever is the KR is for him, the car is his in 3 years. I can't match that. Yeah, and these are the kind of things that have started happening in India, and we are grappling now. We're grappling with the reality. So the way we are looking at this is, on one end, a large part of our business is what we call as a time and material business. Customers pay us on an hourly basis. And with the salaries going up in India, what we are increasingly realizing that if I'm charging my customer $25 an hour today, with the new kind of salaries, I'm just not able to hold that price. Either the customer gives me $40 an hour, or I lose the business. So we have been a little creative, talking about innovation, commercial innovation. What we have gone and told our customers, I'm going to hire 10,000 people, freshers from colleges. I'm going to train them, and I'm going to put them on your projects. I'm not going to bill you for them for the next 3 to 4 months. I'm going to train them hard. And we have a solid engine for training, right? Being in this business with 100,000 plus people in India, we know how to train. We have a very, very robust learning and development program internally. We said we'll train them hard for 4 months, put them on a project. After 4 months, I'm going to charge you $25 an hour, which I typically charge for my 10-year-old engineer. Right? A fresher with 4 months of intense training. Many of these new millennials and Gen Z, Gen X people are coming out so smart, right? An intense training of 4 months, we are able to bill them at $25 an hour, and my cost is a fraction of that. So, and I work very transparently with my customers, tell them this is how I'm going to build my business for you, because if you continue to ask me for people with 10 years experience and only pay me $25 an hour, it's not sustainable for me anymore.
Harshul, there's a bit of a disconnect here somehow, because I think, and it's a feature maybe because I'm in this area for a little while, but we're sort of looking at this very thin slice. And I think what we need to ask ourselves is, if the wages, as you were saying, in India weren't so much lower than they were, what would remain competitive and what would not be competitive? I think that's an important question. The other thing you have to put this together with, and I think you're going to have sessions on learning and education, how do you put this together with the fact that, 75% of people in 5th grade, children in 5th grade classes cannot read a class 2 textbook. And so you have to somehow, I think, and this is a problem when you look at India, because it's such a diverse country that you have the very best and you have the very worst, and you have to bound what you're talking about. But what I'm struck by when you can say that work participation rates at one level are high, and then in the middle of the education distribution, they're not. But the wages there are very low as well.
Spot on.
And so you basically have to look at both the...
So that is the reason we are moving to Tier 2 very aggressively, for 2 reasons. So Hyderabad, Bangalore, Delhi, those cities are very saturated for us. Though many of our customers in North America prefer to work out of those locations, but we are able to now convince them to start looking at Tier 2 where salary scales are lower. More importantly, attrition is low. Yeah, the mindset of Tier 2.
If I could just cut in, because I'm recalling that we had a meeting with Sujata Singh, former Foreign Secretary, when I think I first started covering South Asia. And one of the things she said, she was quoting then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, is India's many centuries coexisting at one time. And I think, Dr. Debroy, you talked about aspirational India as the 7th major pillar underwriting transformation. And I think that offers immense opportunity perhaps to, Vinod, what you're saying, as well as unique challenges for competition, it sounds like, for you at Tech Mahindra, and perhaps opportunities for growth for women specifically. And Nancy highlighted in her remarks this notion that there's $770 billion on the table if we could figure out gender parity in the workforce. And I think there's so many leaders across this room. I'm looking at Rick Rosso. You did one of the first studies, I think, that ever came out of a major think tank in Washington looking at competitiveness for states as a function of female labor force participation. I know Radhika Shah has been a bridge between Washington and Silicon Valley for years, looking at these issues of how we can bring philanthropy, government, and the private sector together. Certainly our little piece of this at the State Department through the Alliance is how do we look at each sector and maximize their potential to recognize the potential that we've heard about all day, but also the real constraints. And so I wondered if you could drill down maybe one recommendation for each sector for how we could really maximize the opportunity for the people that aren't necessarily getting the slice of the growth and the potential. Dr. Somanathan.
Well, the way as an economist we think about this is for each sector to think, what is it that we can do that another sector can't, right? And I think that when you think about the state, I think in terms of public goods, whether it's social infrastructure or physical infrastructure, this is something that nobody else will really be able to do. So that includes, the standard stuff, but now it also includes things like water and climate, and these are things you're going to talk about. I think as far as the corporate sector is concerned, they have to think, look, what are we really good at? And we're good at maximizing profit. We depend on that, right? So let's just figure out what exactly people need training in. And I think that when you're thinking about public-private partnership, it's not just that each person is putting 50% on the table. You're putting specific things on the table which the other side can't do well. And I think that's where the dialogue really counts. What is it that we would succeed in if we just had this from you? And I think that's what you need to talk about. And I think the startup thing is really exciting because you can go to a small area, see a lot of potential and do something, and then it can get copied in multiple places, including in the bigger companies. So that's what I would say.
A small area doing big things. And
Exactly. I think that's a good logo.
A good segue, perhaps, to the work that Sasbumi and Startup Connect are doing through USISPF. I would love for you, I don't want to speak for you, but one of the first conversations I had about Vinod's work was, I think this time last year, we had a really wonderful meeting at Unifor regarding the work, this really powerful statistic: for every dollar you're investing in SaaS founders creates 16 jobs in the United States and 8 in India. And I think that the success kind of tells the story, but I wondered, could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, the numbers have evolved, so you'll be very happy to know. So the statistic was for any Indian founder who moved to the US, one prerequisite is venture funding because it's hard to move, on a non-immigrant visa. Last year created 40 local American jobs at 3-point-something-x of the US median salary. And for each job in the US created 8 jobs in India. So the number is 140, 320, right? That is one non-immigrant visa seeker. Normally a non-immigrant visa seeker with no camouflage is seen as a job seeker, right? You're here to take a job. And the way you assess that visa application is, hey, can I get this job done locally? And if your skills are available in the local market, I'm not going to let you in, right? Whereas this visa seeker is entirely different. This visa seeker is a job creator. And this is the point that we wanted to make on both sides of the fence. But there's something very win-win about this. Historically, trade, you go back all the way to the Western powers in China, and whenever, trade has always been an imbalanced equation, right? Somebody gets disproportionate benefit out of that transaction. But this is actually a win-win. So 140, 320, which means jobs on both sides, okay? Because the person comes here and builds a company, access to capital, that capital comes from pension funds and this and that, the endowments and and all of that. The IP is created in the United States because you go public here, right? And you have incredible prosperity created on both sides of the fence. And the US-India corridor is like secular in the trend, which is both democracies, both believe in the same things. Very coincidentally, also aligned geopolitically, militarily. That's coincidental, but it helps, right? That the two economies are in sync that much. So the opportunity to create this infinite return scenario is incredible, because then you can do the jobs. Then there's the capital to invest in going to tier 3 and beyond, to invest in all of these things. But for that, really, the cross-border movement of human intellect just needs to become insanely easy. I don't think that we're there yet, right? And that's really my big thing. And the one input criteria to this, much before the founder comes here, I also think is access to capital in India. When I was starting my startup, typically venture is available now. I can hand to heart tell you I can raise $20 million today on an idea. but not if you're a first-time founder. So capital, if you go to banks, you need 1.5 times the loan amount and collateral. If you had it, then you don't have a capital constraint. But then the risk of failure is very high. In traditional investment, if you lose that house or that asset, the cost of failure is cataclysmic to your life. So access to capital to create grassroots movement, but as I said, there are 2 other phases before that: access to education, access to opportunity. Only when somebody had a conversation, how do you get the next Elon Musk? You don't. You just give a lot of people opportunity, and the next Musk will kind of present himself or herself, right? So the need to create that baseline where people have access to education, access to opportunity, access to growth, will then create the grounds for all of this progress to happen. So I'll leave you with one thing which I have very, very close to my heart, which is we believe that by the end of this decade, India SaaS will generate $1 trillion of fresh market cap. And India SaaS is essentially Indian founder or startup started in India, or someone like me, which maybe if I start a startup today, significant operations in India, or if you visited the Taj Mahal, we count that also as India SaaS. So it's a fairly broad definition. It's inclusive, not exclusive, right? In our program, we have founders who have nothing to do with India ever, so it's not a cabal. But the point is, India SaaS should create $1 trillion of market cap, and you'll see when you do the P&L of that movement, that would have created jobs, IP, and prosperity in both markets. And that is what I think is the model I want both governments to embrace.
Excellent. Well, I know there's many people in this room that are working on building inclusive economies, and I wondered if anyone wants to ask any questions at this juncture. We can open it up, sir. And I believe there's microphones maybe going around the room. Yeah, sir, over. Oh, or Dr. Dasher, we can start with you, and then we can move.
My question is actually for you, Radhika. In your organization's experience or efforts, how much of a role have MOOCs and Coursera-type programs had in terms of moving women off the bottom of that curve in the valley up to the right?
Well,
or in general for everybody, but certainly for women?
It's a really good question, especially during the pandemic. We saw a huge transformation in terms of how we delivered training for women. One thing that I'm looking at, Karen, we launched in March of last year was a Million Women Mentors initiative. Nancy referred to it a little bit earlier. In partnership with Google, we launched this initiative to connect 1 million women entrepreneurs to training, which pre-pandemic would have been done with in-person training. But Google has used, I think successfully, the pandemic to really develop out top-of-the-line training materials that they're delivering in partnership with nonprofits. It's still too early to see the results from their evaluation. It's happening in India. This is happening in India. And I know USAID can speak to this more tomorrow, but I think MOOCs and online education have been absolutely critical to our work, not just in India, but in all parts of South Asia. I just came from Los Angeles, where we were working on this immensely challenging issue set, which is the education of Afghan women and girls after 6th grade. As many might know, Taliban edicts now restrict women and girls' access to education. So we are looking very concertedly, including with companies like Coursera, at how we can deliver accredited education. And happy to talk about that at length with you if that's something of interest to you. Dr. Dasher?
Thank you. So I'm very interested in the whole issue of churn and on-the-job training, because in a lot of the old IT services firms, having somebody with a recent college education was actually even more important than having someone who had been in the company for a number of years and had learned know-how. But as manufacturing increases, the need for know-how through experience may increase. I'm similarly curious because you have these U-shaped graphs for women's participation in the workforce, but a lot of women are leaving the workforce. Are there ways that companies are trying to encourage them to stay?
I'm certainly happy to answer that. I don't know, Dr. Somanathan, if you or...
So, of course, we are coming up with a lot of women-friendly policies to encourage women not only to join the workforce, but also to stay. What we are realizing is while bringing more women in, of course, it's a challenge, but it's not as big a challenge as making sure women stay with us for long enough. Societal issues, lots of family issues. Many women drop off. I think that's the challenge that we're currently grappling with. So while, as I said earlier, about 35% of our staff is women, we would ideally like to see it beyond 40% in the next 5 years. That's the challenge we've taken on ourselves. Our challenge is, as we look at more mid-management and leadership, the ratio really diminishes. Yeah, and in the leadership levels, probably the women-to-men ratio is probably around 20%. Yeah, so I think that's a challenge we're grappling with. I don't have clear answers, but we are making more and more women-friendly policies for them. Say if they are taking a break from work and want to come back into the workforce, we are giving them reskilling, retraining, free while they are getting paid to come back, and so on and so forth. There's a bunch of this policies that we have made to attract them. And also what happened during the pandemic, because everybody had the flexibility to work from home, we could hire a lot more women associates. And I think the percentage of the gender ratio improved for us during the pandemic dramatically. And also, I think to your question about online training platforms, whether it is a Coursera or what have you, and our own internal learning and training platforms, everything started going online. That just supported more women to upskill themselves, reskill themselves, sitting in their homes, right, rather than coming to office. So those are things that helped us.
I think I do want to hear Dr. Somanathan's perspective on this, and perhaps we need to wrap up. Amit, I'm not sure. Okay. You know, during the pandemic, the exodus of women from the workforce across the world due to lack of childcare and the ability for them to manage work and home responsibilities resulted in, for the United States, what Kamala Harris called a national emergency for our economy. And it's not dissimilar for India or countries around the world. What we saw before the pandemic was traditionally after the first or second child, women could not manage home and work, and that dropped off. Companies like Bank of America, I think, were some of the first companies in India to pilot return to work programs, which are actually critical for helping women. It's not be able to return and have an on-ramp back into employment while managing that dual responsibility. The Biden administration is actually making investments in this space in a large amount. We're starting a multi-donor trust fund with the World Bank to look at ways that we can work with economies, including India, on the issue set of childcare. And I think that will help bring more women into the economy with children. But Dr. Somanathan, over to you.
I just wanted to emphasize I mean, childcare and education goes together, because when you don't have childcare, then even if you manage to go into the workforce, there are often older girls in the household who are looking after children. And one thing, so if you remember the OECD graph, Germany, women basically work only once the kids have gone to school, because children go to school when they're 6. In France, you can go to a public creche when you're 3 months old. A baby can go to a public creche. So there is a diversity of institutional arrangements, but childcare everywhere is really, really important. Another caveat on the online thing, so it offers enormous opportunities, but like all technology, it is double-edged, and you have to think about the social fabric you're imposing this on. So when you looked at public schools in India, it was really a disaster. Nobody learned anything because you were talking about cramped spaces, no cell phone access for a lot of kids, and then all these classes going online. And so I think that you just need to think about the institutions carefully. If, for example, you had the CSR law now in India, which is really innovative. I think it's great. A lot of companies are putting a lot of money into things other than just profit being the bottom line, because the law asks them to. If there was institutionalized childcare that was part of company law, it would change things dramatically. It's just a much, much bigger deal than letting someone coming in, going into areas to look for them. Just there's a place where you can put your child when you come into work. It would transform everything. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I see a hand up over at the back. Yes.
A point to what your point you just made. I volunteer for an organization, a nonprofit called Pratham.
Yes.
And we have a program for women who have, called Second Chance, who
Yeah.
have kind of fallen off the wagon.
Yeah.
Most of the time we have seen that the reason for them falling off the wagon, it's either they have a kid that they need to take care of, not their kid. Their mother had another kid. So they are in the age group of anything from 9 years to 16 years. Most of them have been forced into, young marriages. So they are 15 or 16 and they're married off. They don't have time to study. There are a lot of issues. There is a stigma attached to women going out to a school in certain communities because they are with boys and other men. That's a taboo in that community. So there are a lot of reasons why women are not in the workforce.
Yeah, actually, Pratham is just such a fantastic organization. But Pratham's origins are really with the public school system in Bombay, and precisely through this sort of second chance, not just for women, but for all children. So that's something very interesting that a partnership can do between the public and private sector. Yeah.
Well, I think we are being encouraged to wrap it up. So with one last question, we'll wrap up the conversation.
Question on hiring. So we talked about, we want to hire Gen Z minus, Gen Z plus for startups and companies. There's completely forgotten workforce. It's in the 30s and 40s and 50s who basically stuck in their certain discipline, but they want to change. And so, at least in healthcare, we want to train nurses to become savvy with tech. So can you talk about how India would change that, to be able to help, sort of the Gen A or the Gen B or the Gen C really sort of reskill, change, and be ready for the workforce?
Well,
I think that's a completely hidden force that nobody is tapping into.
Thank you. I think it speaks to the upskilling that some of the conversation between Harshal and Vinod was getting into in the specific instance of nursing. Right behind you, Radhika Shah is spearheading with USISPF a new STEM collaborative, looking at ways to bring philanthropic organizations, corporations, and government together to support innovations in STEM, specifically how to bring more investments in women in STEM. And that might be an area that she could support you in. So she's standing right behind you. I just wanted to point that out, but maybe turn it over to you to respond, maybe perhaps.
I have very simple, if you're in your 30s and 40s, you're in the workforce, I'm there, same age. Upskilling yourself, to be honest, as crude as it sounds, is really your responsibility, right? You're in the workforce, especially if you're in tech. If you're in non-tech, that's why I said if you have the opportunity and you're already there, the world is moving so fast that I have teams of engineers that I can see in 12 months will be completely obsolete, because we were moving off of that stack, moving from on-prem to the cloud. So I generally think if you're in the workforce, your employer needs to be involved, because it's very hard for public policy, I think, to create mid-career opportunity, because public policy is working really on grassroots, right? Which is, hey, are enough girls going to school? Are the schools equipped with the right thing? Is the infrastructure, right? And then public-private comes together when it comes to, hey, are you giving training opportunities, internship? Do you not have any bias in your hiring, right? But when you're already in the workforce, between you and me, things are changing so fast that the greatest custodian of your career, once you're already in the workforce, the other limitations are gone, is you. And that's, I think policy will find it very hard to overcome that. That's really my thought.
I agree.
With that, I think we have to, I think we need to close the conversation and move on. But thank you so much, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you.